Today we're talking about why smart people often turn to procrastinate more. Have you ever been in a room where the smartest person in the room is the one doing the least? Not because they don't care, not because they're lazy, but because their mind is running a calculation everyone else skipped. And that calculation is quietly destroying their execution. If you're someone who tested well in school but struggles to finish projects as an adult, if people always told you that you had so much potential but you can't figure out why that potential never turns into results, if you can see 10 steps ahead but can't seem to take the first one, then what I'm about to tell you will explain everything. Because the reason smart people procrastinate isn't a motivation problem, it's an intelligence problem. And until you understand how your own mind is working against you, you'll keep blaming yourself for a pattern you didn't consciously create. Here's what most people think. Procrastination is about avoiding work. But watch a smart procrastinator closely. They're not avoiding effort. They're working constantly, reading, researching, planning, optimizing. They can spend 6 hours learning about a topic and 0 minutes actually doing anything with it. And at the end of the day, they feel productive. But they've built nothing. Psychology has studied this pattern for decades, and what they've found is uncomfortable. Intelligence doesn't make execution easier. In most cases, it makes it harder. And there are specific mechanisms at work that most people never examine. Let me show you what's happening in your brain. When someone with average intelligence looks at a problem, they see 1 or 2 solutions. They pick one and move. It's simple, it's fast, and most importantly, it's not paralyzing. But when someone with high intelligence looks at the same problem, they see 15 possibilities. Each one branches into sub-possibilities. Each path has pros and cons that need to be weighed. And before they've even started, their mind is running simulations of every potential outcome. Psychologist Barry Schwartz spent years studying this phenomenon. He called it the paradox of choice. And what he found was that the more options you can see, the harder it becomes to choose any of them. Not because you're indecisive, but because your brain is doing something most people's brains don't do. It's calculating opportunity cost in real time. Every choice you make eliminates other choices. And intelligent people feel that loss more acutely. So instead of choosing, they research more. They wait for perfect clarity. They try to find the option that doesn't eliminate anything. And that option doesn't exist. So they stay stuck. Schwartz wrote, "Learning to choose is hard. Learning to choose well is harder. And learning to choose well in a world of unlimited possibilities is harder still. This isn't laziness. This is your intelligence creating a mental traffic jam where every option is blocking every other option. And while you're stuck analyzing, someone with half your intelligence has already picked a direction and moved." Here's where it gets deeper. Intelligence is fundamentally about pattern recognition, the ability to see connections others miss, to anticipate problems before they happen. And in most contexts, that's an advantage. But in execution, it's a trap. Let me paint you a specific picture. You want to start something, a business, a project, a creative endeavor. The moment that idea enters your mind, your brain immediately starts scanning for patterns. And because you're intelligent, you've consumed a lot of information. You've read the articles about why startups fail. You've seen the statistics about how most content gets ignored. You've watched people try and quit. And your brain, doing exactly what it's designed to do, connects those patterns to your current situation. It whispers, "This is probably going to fail. Here's why." And it gives you a dozen reasons. Logical reasons, evidence-based reasons, reasons that sound like wisdom but are actually just fear wearing an intelligent mask. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman identified this as a cognitive bias called loss aversion. The brain weighs potential losses more heavily than equivalent gains. And intelligent people, because they can vividly imagine failure scenarios, feel those potential losses before they've even started. So they don't start, not because they can't, but because their mind has already pre-experienced the failure. And why would you begin something your brain has already concluded won't work? Here's the brutal part. That pattern recognition is often wrong because it's based on other people's failures in different contexts with different variables. But your brain doesn't care about nuance. It cares about safety, and the safest option is always not trying. There's another mechanism at play that's specific to how intelligent people think: mental simulation. Most people think in terms of concrete steps. I need to do A, then B, then C. But intelligent people think in systems. They can mentally simulate the entire process before they physically start it. And this creates a very specific type of procrastination. You don't need to actually do the thing because you've already done it in your head. You've mapped out every step. You've anticipated every problem. You've solved it mentally. And in some strange way, your brain treats that mental completion as real completion. The dopamine hit happens during the simulation, not the execution. So when it's time to actually start, there's no reward left, just effort. Cognitive scientist Philip Johnson Laird studied mental models and found that people who can build complex simulations in their minds often struggle with physical execution. Not because they lack ability, but because the mental version feels finished, and finishing the actual version feels redundant. This is why smart people can spend hours planning but minutes doing. The planning is where the satisfaction lives. Execution feels like a formality. Except in reality, the plan means nothing without the execution. Here's the layer most people miss, and it's the most personal one. If you were labeled as the smart kid growing up, if teachers and parents constantly told you that you were gifted, if your identity became wrapped around your intelligence, then you're carrying a specific psychological burden. Psychologist Carol Dweck spent decades studying mindset, and what she found was that people praised for intelligence develop what she called a fixed mindset. They start to believe that their value comes from being smart, not from learning, not from trying, from already knowing. And here's the trap. If your identity is tied to being intelligent, then failure isn't just a setback. It's a threat to your sense of self. Because if you try something and fail, what does that say about you? Maybe you're not as smart as everyone thought. Maybe you're not special. Maybe you're just average. So instead of risking that exposure, you don't try. Or you only try things you know you'll succeed at. Or you start things, but don't finish them, because an incomplete project can't be judged. As long as it's unfinished, the possibility of greatness still exists. Dweck wrote, "Becoming is better than being." But intelligent people often get stuck in being. They're so attached to the identity of smart that they avoid the process of becoming anything real. And this shows up in a very specific way. You don't procrastinate on easy things. You procrastinate on things that matter. The high-stakes project, the meaningful conversation, the idea that could actually change your life. Because those are the things that test whether your intelligence is real or just potential that never materialized. Let's talk about what's happening in real time when you sit down to work. You open the document, you stare at the blank page, and immediately, your mind starts generating questions. Is this the right approach? Should I research more first? What if there's a better way to do this? What if I start and realize halfway through that I should have done it differently? And here's what makes this different from normal doubt. These aren't irrational fears. They're legitimate questions. And because you're intelligent, you can construct logical arguments for why each question deserves an answer before you proceed. So you don't proceed. You research. You refine. You wait for the clarity that will make execution feel obvious. And that clarity never comes. Because the questions don't stop. Psychologist Albert Ellis, who founded rational emotive behavior therapy, identified this pattern. He called it analysis paralysis. The belief that you need perfect understanding before action is appropriate. And he found that intelligent people are especially vulnerable to it because they have the cognitive capacity to sustain the analysis indefinitely. There's one more mechanism that's specific to intelligent people. Intelligent people don't just compare themselves to their peers. They compare themselves to the best version of what they could be. And that comparison is brutal. When you can clearly visualize your potential, when you can see exactly what you're capable of if you executed perfectly, every real attempt feels like a disappointment, because reality is always messier than the ideal. And for someone who's used to being right, used to understanding things quickly, used to performing well without trying, that gap between potential and reality feels unbearable. So instead of tolerating the gap, they avoid creating anything real, because as long as it stays in their head, it can stay perfect. Here's what all of this adds up to. Your intelligence isn't helping you execute, it's protecting you from execution. And it's doing it in ways that feel like wisdom, like thoughtfulness, like being strategic. But underneath all of that, it's just fear. Fear that you're not as capable as people think. Fear that your intelligence was only useful in controlled environments like school, where problems had clear answers. Fear that in the real world, where problems are ambiguous and feedback is harsh, you might just be average. And smart people can't tolerate being average. So they don't try, they optimize, they prepare, they simulate. And they call it strategic thinking when it's really just sophisticated avoidance. So how do you break this pattern? You don't try to think your way out of it. You can't, because thinking is the trap. You act before you're ready, not because you're reckless, but because readiness is a moving target your mind will chase forever. Intelligent people wait for certainty. But certainty doesn't exist in execution, it only exists in hindsight. You set artificially low standards. This goes against everything your intelligence tells you, but here's the truth. Your high standards aren't protecting quality, they're preventing quantity. And quantity is what creates skill. You don't get good by thinking about doing something perfectly. You get good by doing it repeatedly at a mediocre level until mediocre becomes competent and competent becomes excellent. You stop researching and start testing. Intelligent people love research because it feels productive and it's risk-free. But research is infinite. There will always be one more article, one more perspective, one more framework to understand. So you cap it. You give yourself a research deadline. And after that deadline, everything else has to be learned through doing. Because here's what smart people forget. Execution generates information that research never could. Real feedback from real attempts is worth more than 1,000 theoretical frameworks. But you only get that feedback by moving. You redefine what success means. Right now, success means doing it perfectly, matching the vision in your head, proving your intelligence was justified. But that definition guarantees paralysis. Success becomes starting. Success becomes finishing badly. Success becomes learning one thing you couldn't have learned without trying. And once success is redefined as movement instead of mastery, your intelligence stops being an obstacle and starts being an asset. When you stop letting your intelligence run the show, you don't suddenly become less smart. You just become less imprisoned by it. You start to see that overthinking isn't depth, it's avoidance. That endless planning isn't strategy, it's procrastination with a professional veneer. The people building real things aren't smarter than you, they're just less afraid of being wrong. They don't need to understand everything before they start. They're comfortable with confusion, they tolerate imperfection, and they value messy action over pristine theory. Intelligence is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used to build or to hide. Right now, you're using it to hide, behind research, behind planning, behind the safety of potential. But potential isn't real. It's just a story you tell yourself to avoid finding out what you're actually capable of. So here's your move. Identify one thing you've been overthinking. Not the big project, just one small action you've analyzed to death, and do it today, badly, imperfectly, without waiting for one more piece of information. Not because you're ready, but because your intelligence has had enough time to protect you. Because the gap between smart and successful isn't intelligence, it's execution. And execution doesn't care how much you know, it only cares what you do. If this explained why your intelligence feels like a curse sometimes, subscribe. Next time, we're breaking down why discipline makes you feel productive but keeps you poor. And it's going